There are moments when witnessing cruelty changes everything, when seeing someone helpless breaks something deep inside us. In a dimly lit tavern, Lord Aldric grips his wife's wrist and speaks words that chill the room. "You're dead at dawn." Elena knows there's no escape from this brutal marriage that paid her father's debts. A pale stranger sits nearby, watching from the shadows. He's an ancient vampire who has stayed hidden for centuries. He never interferes with human affairs. Tonight is different. As Elena weeps and her husband threatens her life, something awakens in the vampire's heart. For the first time in ages, he's about to break his own rules. But what could make an immortal creature risk everything for a mortal woman? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silver locket around Elena's neck caught the firelight as she pressed herself against the rough stone wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. The ornate piece of jewelry held her mother's portrait, the only remnant of a life that felt like someone else's memory now. 6 months ago, she had been Lady Elena of House Ravencroft, daughter of a respected nobleman with vast estates and a promising future. Tonight, she was nothing more than Lord Aldric's possession, a human currency exchanged to settle her father's catastrophic gambling debts. The marriage contract lay locked away in Aldric's strongbox, its parchment stained with both their blood, a barbaric custom he had insisted upon to ensure the binding was absolute. Elena remembered the way the quill had trembled in her hand as she signed away her freedom, the metallic taste of her own blood as Aldric pricked her finger with his dagger. Her father hadn't even looked at her during the ceremony, his eyes fixed on the gold coins that would save him from debtor's prison. "Please," she whispered now, though she knew begging only fueled Aldric's cruelty. The man who owned her was not known for mercy. Lord Aldric Blackthorn stood 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders that spoke of years wielding a sword in service to the crown. His dark hair was always perfectly groomed, his beard trimmed to sharp angles that matched the coldness in his grey eyes. He wore his nobility like armour, using his title and wealth to crush anyone who dared oppose him. At 35, he had already buried 2 wives. Both had died under mysterious circumstances that no one dared investigate too closely. "Your tears bore me, wife," Aldric said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "I've told you before that weakness disgusts me. Perhaps a night in the dungeons will remind you of your place." Elena's fingers unconsciously touched the healing bruises on her arms, hidden beneath the long sleeves of her burgundy dress. Aldric preferred his violence to be private, inflicted where prying eyes couldn't witness his handiwork. The servants in Blackthorn Manor had learned long ago not to ask questions about their mistress's frequent accidents. In the shadows of the tavern, Matthias Draven observed the scene with growing unease. For 800 years, he had walked among mortals as an invisible witness to their joys and sorrows, their triumphs and cruelties. He had learned to watch without feeling, to observe without judgment. It was the only way an immortal could survive the endless parade of human suffering without going mad. But something about the young woman's quiet dignity in the face of brutality stirred memories he had buried centuries ago. She reminded him of someone, a fleeting image of another dark-haired beauty whose fate he had been powerless to change. The similarity was unsettling, awakening emotions he had thought long dead. Matthias had been born in the year 1247, the 3rd son of a minor lord in what would later become England. His mortal life had ended abruptly at 28, when he encountered an ancient vampire named Lucinda during a hunt in the deep forests near his family's estate. She had turned him not out of love or companionship, but because she sensed the potential for great power within him. The transformation had been agony beyond description, 3 days of burning fever as his human blood was replaced by something darker and infinitely more potent. When he emerged from the change, He possessed strength that could shatter stone, speed that made him appear as little more than a blur to mortal eyes, and senses so acute he could hear a whispered conversation from a mile away. Most importantly, he discovered he could command other vampires, a rare ability that marked him as a natural leader among the undead. Within a century, Matthias had become the alpha of the largest vampire coven in northern Europe. He ruled with wisdom and restraint, establishing laws that protected both vampires and humans from unnecessary bloodshed. His reign was marked by an unprecedented peace between the supernatural world and mortal society. Vampires fed carefully, taking only what they needed, while humans remained blissfully unaware of the creatures that moved among them. The betrayal that ended his reign came not from enemies, but from those closest to him. His lieutenant, a vampire named Victor, whom he had considered a brother, had orchestrated a conspiracy that painted Matthias as a tyrant who favored humans over his own kind. The accusations were false, but they spread like wildfire through the coven. When the challenge came, Matthias could have fought to maintain his position. His power was greater than any who opposed him. Instead, he chose exile, walking away from everything he had built, rather than shed the blood of those he had once protected. For 6 centuries he had wandered alone, never staying in one place long enough to form attachments. He had watched the rise and fall of kingdoms, witnessed plagues that decimated entire populations, and observed the slow march of human progress with detached interest. He fed sparingly, taking only from those who wouldn't be missed, brigands and murderers whose deaths would make the world a slightly better place. The tavern where he now sat was called the Weeping Maiden, a fitting name for an establishment that catered to travelers seeking to forget their troubles in strong ale and stronger spirits. The building itself was ancient, its timber walls scarred by centuries of use and its floors worn smooth by countless boots. Smoke from the central hearth mingled with the aroma of roasted meat and the less pleasant odors of unwashed bodies and spilled beer. Matthias had chosen a table in the darkest corner, where the shadows were thick enough to hide his pale complexion and the subtle luminescence that marked him as something other than human. His appearance drew attention. Despite his efforts to blend in, he stood 6.5 feet tall, with the kind of lean, predatory grace that suggested barely contained power. His black hair was longer than current fashion dictated, framing aristocratic features that would have been considered handsome if not for the cold perfection that marked him as inhuman. Most unsettling were his eyes, which appeared deep blue in dim light, but flashed with amber fire when his emotions were aroused. He wore simple traveling clothes, a dark wool coat over a white linen shirt, black trousers, and well-worn boots. The only ornamentation was an ancient ring on his right hand, its black stone carved with symbols that predated written language. The ring was a mark of his former status as Alpha, though it now served primarily to remind him of everything he had lost. "I should have left you to rot with your father," Aldric continued, his voice rising enough that other patrons began to take notice. "At least he had the courtesy to lose his fortune quickly. You, on the other hand, are a constant reminder of what I had to pay to acquire these pathetic lands." Elena's inheritance had included more than gold. She brought with her claim to ancient estates that bordered Aldric's own holdings. The marriage had made him one of the most powerful landowners in the region, but his cruelty toward his wife had earned him few friends among the local nobility. Many whispered that his ambitions stretched far beyond mere wealth, that he harbored dreams of challenging the crown itself. The political landscape of medieval England was treacherous, with powerful lords constantly maneuvering for advantage. King Edward's grip on power was strong, but there were always those who believed they could do better. Aldric had been careful to keep his treasonous thoughts private, but Elena had overheard enough conversations to know that her husband's plans went far beyond brutalizing a helpless wife. "You will smile tomorrow at the harvest feast," Aldric commanded, leaning close enough that Elena could smell the wine on his breath. "You will play the role of the devoted wife, and you will not embarrass me in front of my guests. If you fail in this simple task, I promise you will not see another sunrise." Elena nodded wordlessly, knowing that resistance would only make her punishment worse. She had learned to survive by becoming invisible, by anticipating Aldric's moods and avoiding the worst of his rages. It was a hollow existence, but it was existence nonetheless. From his shadowed corner, Matthias felt his hands clench into fists beneath the rough wooden table. The scent of Elena's fear was sharp in the air, mixed with the metallic tang of old blood and the bitter aroma of tears barely held in check. Every instinct he possessed as a predator told him to intervene, to eliminate the source of her suffering with swift, brutal efficiency. But he had sworn an oath 6 centuries ago, never again would he use his power to interfere in mortal affairs. The consequences of his involvement inevitably brought more suffering than healing. Humans were fragile creatures with brief, complicated lives. Their problems were theirs to solve. Yet, as Elena raised her chin with quiet defiance, her dark eyes reflecting a spirit that refused to be completely broken, Matthias felt something crack in the careful walls he had built around his heart. She was perhaps 20 years old, with the kind of natural grace that spoke of noble birth and careful education. Her dark brown hair was bound in an elaborate style that emphasized the elegant line of her neck, and despite months of abuse, she carried herself with dignity that no amount of cruelty could completely erase. The silver locket at her throat caught the light again as she moved, and Matthias found himself wondering about the portrait it contained, a parent perhaps, or a lost love from her former life. Whatever it represented, she guarded it carefully, her hand moving instinctively to protect it whenever Aldric drew near. "Come," Aldric said finally, standing with the casual arrogance of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. "We return to the manor. I have preparations to make for tomorrow's festivities, and you have a performance to rehearse." Elena rose on unsteady legs, her movements careful and deliberate. As she passed Matthias's table, their eyes met for the briefest instant. In that moment, he saw past her fear to something deeper, a fierce intelligence and a strength that even Aldric's cruelty hadn't been able to destroy. She was fighting back in the only way available to her, by refusing to let him break her spirit completely. Matthias watched them leave, noting the way Aldric's hand gripped Elena's arm with casual brutality, the way she held herself apart from him despite being forced to walk at his side. The tavern seemed quieter after their departure, as if their dark drama had cast a shadow over the evening's revelry. For the first time in centuries, the vampire found himself considering the possibility of breaking his vow. The ancient ring on Matthias's finger pulsed with a faint, otherworldly energy as he followed Lord Aldric and Elena through the winding streets of the village. The black stone had been carved by vampire artisans over a millennium ago, its surface etched with symbols that spoke of power, authority, and the burden of leadership. Once, it had been a symbol of pride. Now it served as a constant reminder of everything he had abandoned. The village of Ravenshire nestled in a valley between rolling hills, its narrow streets paved with stones worn smooth by generations of travellers. Most of the buildings were timber-framed with steep pitched roofs, their upper stories jutting out over the street in the medieval fashion. Oil lamps flickered in windows, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. Matthias maintained his distance, his supernatural senses allowing him to track the couple even when they passed beyond normal sight. He could hear Elena's quickened heartbeat, smell the fear that clung to her like a shroud, and sense the barely contained violence that radiated from her husband. The vampire's enhanced abilities made him acutely aware of the emotional currents that flowed between them, her desperate hope for escape and his cold satisfaction at having complete control over another human being. Blackthorn Manor loomed at the end of the village's main thoroughfare, a fortress-like structure that spoke of wealth built on the suffering of others. Its stone walls rose 3 stories high, topped with battlements that suggested Aldric took his security seriously. Torches burned in iron brackets along the walls, casting pools of yellow light that did little to soften the building's harsh lines. As they approached the manor's gates, Aldric's grip on Elena's arm tightened. "Remember what I told you about tomorrow," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. "Smile, be charming, and do nothing to embarrass me. The harvest feast is important to my plans." Elena nodded silently, but Matthias could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself as if expecting a blow. The vampire's hands clenched at his sides as he watched Aldric push her roughly through the gates, treating her like a piece of property rather than a human being. The harvest feast was a tradition in rural communities, a celebration of the year's crops that brought together nobles and commoners alike. For a man like Aldric, it represented an opportunity to display his wealth and power, to remind his neighbors of their place in the social hierarchy. The vampire had observed many such gatherings over the centuries, noting how they often served as cover for darker purposes, political plotting, arranged marriages, or the settling of old scores. Matthias settled into the shadows across from the manor, his preternatural patience allowing him to remain motionless for hours without discomfort. The ring on his finger pulsed more strongly now, as if responding to his emotional turmoil. The artifact had been created to enhance the natural abilities of vampire leaders, allowing them to sense the emotional states of their subjects and project their own will across great distances. In his hands, it had once been a tool of unity and order. Now it served mainly to amplify his growing sense of isolation. The hours passed slowly as the manor settled into its nighttime routine. Servants moved behind illuminated windows, preparing for the morrow's festivities. Matthias could see Elena's silhouette in an upper window, her movements suggesting someone who was trying to stay busy to avoid thinking about her circumstances. Several times he saw her touch the silver locket at her throat, as if drawing strength from whatever memory it contained. Near midnight, Matthias's enhanced hearing picked up the sound of raised voices from within the manor. Aldric's tone was harsh and commanding, while Elena's responses were too quiet to distinguish clearly. The vampire found himself moving closer, despite his better judgment, drawn by an inexplicable need to know what was happening. The argument seemed to center around Elena's behavior at the tavern. Aldric was berating her for showing what he termed inappropriate emotion in public, claiming that her tears had made him look weak in front of potential allies. Elena's attempts to defend herself only seemed to inflame his anger further. "You will learn to control yourself," Aldric said, his voice rising to a shout that echoed through the manor's halls. "I will not have my wife making me look like a fool who cannot manage his own household." The sound of a hand striking flesh carried clearly through the stone walls, followed by Elena's sharp cry of pain. Matthias felt his carefully maintained control slip for the first time in decades. The ring on his finger blazed with sudden light, responding to his surge of emotion, and he had to consciously force his supernatural nature back into hiding. When Elena appeared in her window again, Matthias could see even at a distance that she was holding one side of her face. Her movements were careful, pained, and the vampire found himself taking an involuntary step toward the manor before catching himself. This was not his fight, these were not his people. He had learned through bitter experience that vampire interference in mortal affairs inevitably led to disaster. The humans he tried to help often ended up worse off than before, and his own kind viewed such intervention as a betrayal of their fundamental nature. Yet as he watched Elena struggle to compose herself, straightening her spine despite her pain and refusing to give in to despair, Matthias felt something stir within his chest that he had thought long dead. It was not mere attraction, though he could not deny that her courage in the face of overwhelming odds was compelling. Rather, it was recognition, the acknowledgement of a kindred spirit who understood what it meant to endure suffering with dignity intact. The vampire had spent 6 centuries avoiding such connections, knowing that his immortal nature made any relationship with mortals ultimately tragic. He would watch them age and die while remaining unchanged, or he would be forced to abandon them to protect both their lives and his secret. It was easier to remain alone, to observe from the shadows without becoming emotionally invested in the brief dramas of human existence. But something about Elena's situation had penetrated his carefully constructed emotional armor. Perhaps it was the way she had looked at him in the tavern, not with the usual fear or disgust that his otherworldly nature sometimes provoked, but with a desperate hope that suggested she sensed he might be different from the men who had controlled and betrayed her. As dawn approached, Matthias made a decision that violated every principle he had lived by for the past 600 years. He would not simply observe Elena's suffering from afar, he would act to prevent it. The vampire's first intervention was subtle, almost instinctive. When a drunk nobleman stumbled too close to Elena during the next evening's festivities, Matthias appeared as if from nowhere to steady the man and guide him away. When a servant accidentally spilled wine on Elena's dress, clearly at Aldric's instruction to humiliate her, the vampire's presence nearby somehow caused the servant to trip, sending the wine onto Aldric instead. Each time, Elena noticed. Their eyes would meet across crowded rooms, and Matthias would see a flicker of understanding in her gaze. She began to realize that someone was watching over her, though she couldn't yet comprehend the supernatural nature of her protector. Aldric, meanwhile, grew increasingly frustrated by the small accidents and coincidences that seemed to interfere with his plans to publicly humiliate his wife. His paranoia began to focus on the pale stranger who had appeared in the village around the same time these incidents began. There was something unsettling about the man, the way he moved with predatory grace, the uncanny paleness of his skin, and most disturbing of all, the way servants and animals seemed to grow nervous in his presence. The harvest feast itself proved to be a test of wills between Aldric and his mysterious tormentor. Throughout the evening, every attempt to demean Elena was somehow thwarted. When Aldric tried to force her to serve his guests like a common servant, several prominent nobles suddenly required his immediate attention on urgent business matters. When he began to berate her publicly for some imagined slight, a commotion at another table drew everyone's focus away. By the end of the evening, Aldric's rage was barely contained. He had been made to look ineffectual in front of the very people he was trying to impress, and he knew with absolute certainty that the pale stranger was somehow responsible. As the guests departed and the manor settled into quiet, he made his own decision, one that would force the mysterious protector to reveal himself. Elena would indeed be dead at dawn, but not in the manner Aldric had originally intended. This time, he would make sure there was no possibility of interference. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change all their lives forever. The ivory dice that had sealed Elena's fate lay forgotten in a dusty corner of her father's abandoned study, their bone-white surface stained with years of desperate handling. Lord Edmund Ravencroft had clutched those dice through countless nights of gambling, believing each throw might restore his family's fortune. Instead, they had cost him everything: his wealth, his honor, and ultimately his daughter's freedom. Elena had discovered the cursed objects weeks after her forced marriage, hidden beneath a loose floorboard along with her father's final letter. In it, he had tried to justify his actions, claiming he had been certain the next game would win back everything he had lost. The dice represented more than mere bad luck. They were a symbol of how addiction and false hope could destroy innocent lives. Now, as Aldric's footsteps echoed through the manor's corridors in the pre-dawn hours, Elena clutched her mother's locket and wished she had thrown those dice into the deepest well she could find. Perhaps then she might have avoided the fate that now approached with deadly certainty. Aldric's plan was brutally simple. He would claim that Elena had tried to flee in the night, forcing him to pursue her to the cliffs overlooking the valley. There, she would slip and fall to her death, a tragic accident that would generate sympathy rather than suspicion. Her body would be too damaged by the fall for anyone to notice the knife wound he planned to inflict first. The bedroom door burst open with enough force to rattle the iron hinges. Aldric stood silhouetted in the doorway, fully dressed despite the early hour. In his hand, he carried a hunting knife, whose blade gleamed in the lamplight. "Time to go, my dear wife," he said with mock gentleness. "Dawn approaches, and I am a man of my word." Elena pressed herself against the far wall, her heart hammering as she sought some avenue of escape. The window was too high and too narrow, and Aldric's bulk blocked the only door. She had always known this moment might come, but facing it now filled her with a terror so pure it threatened to overwhelm her reason. "Please," she whispered, hating herself for begging but unable to stop the words. "I've done nothing to deserve this." Aldric's laugh was cold and mirthless. "You exist, Elena. That is crime enough. Your very presence reminds me daily of what I had to pay to acquire your father's lands. Every time I look at you, I see those pathetic dice and remember how much gold I spent to clean up his mess." He advanced slowly, savoring her fear like fine wine. But tonight's humiliation was the final straw. That pale stranger made me look weak in front of men whose respect I need. Since I cannot yet move openly against him, you will pay the price for his interference." Elena's fingers found the silver locket, and for a moment she thought of her mother's gentle wisdom and unwavering strength. Lady Catherine Ravenscroft had faced her own death with dignity when fever claimed her. Surely Elena could find the courage to do the same. "I am ready," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Aldric's eyes widened with genuine surprise. He had expected tears, pleas for mercy, perhaps an offer to do anything he demanded if only he would spare her life. Instead, Elena straightened her spine and met his gaze with quiet defiance. "How disappointing," he said finally. "I had hoped for more entertainment before the end." The attack came without warning. Aldric lunged forward with the knife raised, his face twisted with rage and bloodlust. Elena threw herself sideways, but there was nowhere to go in the confined space. The blade descended toward her heart and stopped. A pale hand gripped Aldric's wrist with enough force to make the bones creak. The Lord of Blackthorn Manor found himself face to face with the mysterious stranger, though no sound had announced his arrival. Up close, the man's otherworldly nature was unmistakable. Skin like marble, eyes that glowed with amber fire, and an aura of barely contained power that made the air itself seem to thicken. "I believe," Matthias said in a voice like velvet over steel, "that the lady has declined your invitation." Aldric tried to pull free, but the stranger's grip was immovable. The hunting knife fell from nerveless fingers as supernatural strength slowly crushed the bones of his wrist. "What are you?" Aldric gasped, his face pale with shock and pain. "I am someone who has grown tired of watching you abuse your wife," Matthias replied. With casual ease, he lifted Aldric off his feet and hurled him across the room. The nobleman struck the far wall with enough force to crack the stone, then slumped to the floor, unconscious. Elena stared at her rescuer in amazement and growing terror. No human possessed such strength, and the way shadows seemed to bend around him suggested powers beyond mortal ken. Yet when he turned to face her, his expression was gentle despite the inhuman glow in his eyes. "Are you injured?" he asked, his voice losing its threatening edge. Elena shook her head wordlessly, unable to trust her voice. Up close, she could see that his pale skin held an almost luminescent quality, and his dark hair seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Most unsettling were his features, too perfect, too symmetrical, as if carved by an artist rather than shaped by nature. "You're not human," she said finally. "No," Matthias admitted, "I am not." The simple honesty of his answer helped Elena find her courage. "Are you going to kill me?" "Never." The word carried such absolute conviction that Elena felt her terror begin to ebb. "I give you my oath that no harm will come to you while I draw breath." Elena looked at Aldric's unconscious form, noting the unnatural angle of his arm. "Is he dead?" "No." though he will wish he were when he wakes. The injury to his wrist will heal, but slowly and poorly. He will never again have the strength to strike a defenseless woman. The vampire moved closer, his movements fluid and predatory, yet somehow reassuring. I must ask you to trust me, Elena. Your husband will not give up his plans for revenge, and when he wakes, he will seek allies who can help him destroy us both. Us. Elena's voice was barely a whisper. I have broken ancient laws by intervening in mortal affairs. My kind do not look kindly on such transgressions. By saving you, I have likely condemned myself, but I find I do not regret the choice. Elena studied his face, searching for deception and finding none. Whatever he was, whatever dark powers he possessed, she sensed no malice directed toward her. Instead, she saw something that reminded her of her own situation, a profound loneliness that spoke of long years spent in isolation. "What are you?" she asked again, this time with genuine curiosity rather than fear. Matthias was quiet for a long moment, as if weighing how much truth she could bear. "I am vampire," he said finally, "a creature that should be your enemy by all rights of nature and tradition." Elena nodded slowly, as if this revelation explained things that had puzzled her. "That's why you move so quietly, why shadows seem to follow you. Among other things." "Yes." She looked again at Aldric's unconscious form, then back at the supernatural being who had risked everything to save her life. "Thank you," she said simply. Matthias felt something crack in the careful walls around his heart. In all his centuries of existence, no one had ever thanked him for revealing his monstrous nature. The blood chalice of binding sat in a place of honor within the ancient vampire stronghold of Sanguine Keep, its ornate silver surface gleaming with otherworldly light. Carved from a single piece of black obsidian and rimmed with precious metals, the chalice had been used for over 2 millennia to seal the most sacred oaths of vampire society. Every alpha who had ever ruled had drunk from its depths, binding themselves to laws that governed their immortal kind. Matthias could picture it clearly as he led Elena through the pre-dawn forest, remembering the weight of the chalice in his hands during his own ascension ceremony. He had sworn before assembled vampire lords to uphold the ancient ways, to maintain the delicate balance between their world and that of mortals, and above all, to never use his power for purely personal gain. By saving Elena's life, he had shattered every vow he had ever made. The forest surrounding Ravensshire was old beyond mortal memory, its towering oaks and elms having witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations. Moonlight filtered through the canopy in silver streams, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow that seemed to dance with each passing breeze. For Matthias, the darkness held no terrors. His supernatural senses revealed every detail of their surroundings with perfect clarity. Elena walked beside him with surprising composure, her hand resting lightly on his arm for guidance through the gloom. She had abandoned her restrictive court dress for simpler traveling clothes, borrowed from her maid's quarters, a practical wool gown in deep brown, sturdy leather boots, and a warm cloak that helped her blend with the shadows. "Tell me about yourself," she said quietly as they followed a deer path deeper into the woods. "Before tonight, before you became what you are now." Matthias was surprised by the directness of her question. Most mortals, when confronted with his true nature, either fled in terror or demanded to know how many people he had killed. Elena seemed more interested in understanding him as a person rather than cataloguing his supernatural abilities. "I was born in 1247, he began, his voice taking on the cadence of memory. "The third son of Lord William Draven, whose lands bordered the Welsh marches. It was a violent time, English nobles constantly fighting with Welsh princes, bandits roaming the countryside, and the common folk caught between all sides." Elena listened intently as he spoke of his mortal life, the martial training that had shaped his youth, the deep love he had felt for his family's lands, and the sense of duty that had driven him to protect those under his father's rule. "I was hunting in the deep forest when I encountered her," Matthias continued. Lucinda appeared as a beautiful woman in distress, claiming bandits had attacked her traveling party. By the time I realized the truth, it was too late. "The transformation," Elena said softly. "Was it painful?" "Beyond description. 3 days of fever and agony as my mortal blood was burned away and replaced with something darker. When I emerged, I was stronger and faster than any human, but I was no longer truly alive." Matthias paused beside a stream that cut through the forest, its water sparkling in the moonlight. "Lucinda told me I had been chosen for greatness. She was right. In her way, within a century, I commanded the largest vampire coven in northern Europe." Elena knelt by the stream's edge, cupping the cold water in her hands to drink. "You speak of it as if it were a burden rather than a blessing." "Power always is," Matthias replied. "The more you have, the more people depend on you to use it wisely. I established laws that protected both vampires and humans, created a peace that lasted for centuries. I thought I was building something permanent." The vampire's expression darkened as he spoke of Victor's betrayal, how his most trusted lieutenant had turned the coven against him through lies and manipulation. The conspiracy had painted Matthias as a tyrant who favored humans over his own kind, a dangerous precedent in a society where mortals were traditionally viewed as little more than prey. "When the challenge came, I could have fought," Matthias said. "My power was greater than any who opposed me. But that would have meant civil war among our kind, and innocent vampires would have died for my pride." Elena stood and moved closer to him, her dark eyes reflecting the moonlight. "So you chose exile instead." "I walked away from everything I had built. For 6 centuries I have wandered alone, never staying anywhere long enough to form attachments. I told myself it was for the best, that vampires and humans were too different to coexist peacefully." They resumed walking, following the stream toward higher ground, where ancient standing stones marked the boundaries of sacred groves. Elena was quiet for a long time, absorbing the weight of Matthias's confession. "What changed?" she asked finally. "What made you break your vow of non-interference?" Matthias stopped walking and turned to face her fully. In the moonlight, Elena looked ethereal, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her face pale but determined. The silver locket at her throat caught the light, reminding him of all she had lost. "You did," he said simply. "Your courage in the face of Aldric's cruelty, the way you refused to let him break your spirit completely. You reminded me that some things are worth fighting for, even if the cost is everything." Elena stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her mortal form. "I'm not worth destroying your immortal existence. You are worth more than you know," Matthias replied. "In you, I see everything noble about humanity: compassion, resilience, the ability to find hope in the darkest circumstances. Aldric tried to reduce you to a possession, but you remained yourself, despite everything." Their conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of hoofbeats echoing through the forest. Aldric had awakened and discovered their escape, and he was not pursuing them alone. The thunder of multiple horses suggested he had gathered allies, possibly including the local constabulary or hired mercenaries. Matthias felt his supernatural senses expand, cataloguing the approaching threats. At least a dozen riders, all armed and moving with military precision. Among them, he detected something else, a scent that made his blood run cold. "We need to move," he said urgently, taking Elena's hand. "Aldric has brought vampire hunters." Elena's eyes widened. "Vampire hunters? They truly exist?" "Unfortunately, yes. They are mortals who have dedicated their lives to destroying our kind, and they possess weapons and knowledge that make them extremely dangerous." As they ran deeper into the forest, Matthias explained the ancient war between vampires and those who hunted them. The hunters were typically descendants of vampire victims, trained from childhood in the arts of tracking and killing the undead. They used blessed silver weapons, holy water, and ancient rituals that could weaken even the most powerful vampires. "How does Aldric know such people?" Elena gasped as they climbed toward the standing stones. "Your husband is more dangerous than either of us realized," Matthias replied grimly. "This was planned. He anticipated that someone might interfere with his plans for you." Sir Gareth Blackwood's silver cross burned against his chest as he rode through the moonlit forest, its blessed metal responding to the presence of unholy creatures nearby. The cross had been passed down through 5 generations of his family, each bearer adding their own consecrations to its power. Forged from silver, mined from sacred ground, and blessed by 3 different archbishops, the artifact could weaken vampires merely by proximity and cause agonizing pain with direct contact. The knight urged his destrier forward, following the trail left by the fleeing vampire and his human accomplice. Gareth had devoted his life to hunting the undead, driven by a burning need for vengeance that had consumed him for over 2 decades. His family had been slaughtered by vampires when he was barely 16, his parents' younger sister, and betrothed all drained dry in a single night of horror that had shaped everything he would become. Behind him rode 11 other hunters, each bearing weapons specifically designed to kill supernatural creatures. They carried crossbows loaded with silver-tipped bolts, swords blessed by holy men, and vials of water from the River Jordan. Most importantly, they possessed the knowledge passed down through generations of their kind, how to track vampires, how to anticipate their tactics, and how to exploit their few vulnerabilities. Lord Aldric rode among them, his injured wrist bound but his face twisted with rage and humiliation. The nobleman had contacted the hunters through intermediaries, claiming his wife had been bewitched by a demon masquerading as a man. It was a story that explained her seeming compliance with her captor, while casting Aldric as a concerned husband rather than a would-be murderer. "The tracks lead toward the old stone circle," Gareth called back to his companions. "If the creature seeks sanctuary among pagan ruins, we'll smoke him out with holy fire." The standing stones were ancient beyond memory, predating both Christian and Roman influence in the region. Local legend claimed they had been raised by druids who worshipped dark gods, making them a logical hiding place for creatures that shunned the light of divine grace. What the hunters didn't know was that the stones served a different purpose entirely. They marked a gateway between the mortal world and realms where vampires held greater power. Matthias sensed the approaching threat long before the hunters came within sight of the stone circle. His supernatural hearing picked up the jingle of mail, the creak of leather, and most tellingly, the whispered prayers that vampire hunters used to steel their courage. More concerning was the blessed silver they carried. He could smell its distinctive scent on the wind, sharp and clean like winter air. "They're close," he warned Elena as they reached the base of the largest standing stone. The monolith rose 15 feet into the air, its surface covered with carved spirals and symbols that seemed to shift in the moonlight. Elena pressed her back against the cool stone, trying to catch her breath after their desperate flight through the forest. "Can you defeat them?" Matthias considered the question carefully. Under normal circumstances, a dozen mortal hunters would pose little threat to a vampire of his age and power. But these men were professionals who had spent years learning how to kill his kind, and they carried weapons specifically designed to overcome supernatural advantages. "Possibly," he said finally, "but not without risk to both of us. Vampire hunters are trained to use hostages against their quarry. They know that some of us form attachments to mortals." Elena touched her silver locket absently, a gesture that had become habit during times of stress. Inside the ornate pendant was a miniature portrait of her mother, painted during happier times when the Ravencroft family had been whole and prosperous. Lady Catherine's gentle smile seemed to offer comfort even in this desperate moment. "I won't be used as a weapon against you," Elena said firmly. "Tell me how to help." Matthias was struck once again by her courage. Most mortals in her situation would be paralyzed with terror, But Elena faced each new crisis with determination to take some control over her fate. "The stones hold power," he explained, placing his hand against the carved surface. "They were erected by people who understood the thin places between worlds. If I can activate their magic, we might escape to somewhere the hunters cannot follow." "What kind of magic?" "A pathway to the shadow realm, a place where vampires can move freely without concern for mortal laws or limitations. But the journey is dangerous, and there's no guarantee you would survive the transition." Elena looked at the approaching torchlight flickering between the trees, then back at Matthias's concerned face. "What would happen to me there?" "I don't know," he admitted. "The shadow realm reflects the true nature of all who enter it. Mortals sometimes emerge changed, if they emerge at all." The sound of hoofbeats grew louder as the hunters closed in on their position. Elena could hear voices now, rough men calling to each other as they coordinated their search. One voice rose above the rest, Sir Gareth's commanding tone, directing his followers to surround the stone circle. "Whatever happens," Elena said quietly, "I'm grateful you tried to save me." Matthias felt something shift in his chest, a warmth he hadn't experienced in centuries of cold existence. Looking at Elena's face in the moonlight, brave despite her fear, determined to face whatever came next with dignity, he realized that his feelings had evolved far beyond mere protection or sympathy. "Elena," he began, then stopped as the weight of truth settled over him. How could he burden her with declarations of love when their situation was so desperate? She seemed to understand anyway. Her hand found his, their fingers intertwining with surprising naturalness. "I know," she said softly. "I feel it too." The moment was shattered by the appearance of armed figures at the edge of the clearing. Sir Gareth rode into the stone circle first, his blessed cross gleaming silver in the moonlight. The other hunters followed, forming a ring around the ancient monuments with military precision. "Release the woman, demon," Gareth commanded, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. "She has committed no crime, save trusting the wrong man." Aldric emerged from behind the knight, his face twisted with malicious satisfaction. "Elena, my dear wife, you have caused quite enough trouble for one evening. Come away from this monster, and I might find it in my heart to forgive your temporary madness." Elena stepped closer to Matthias rather than away from him. "I am exactly where I choose to be," she called back, her voice clear and strong. The defiance in her tone seemed to shock even Gareth, whose worldview didn't account for willing cooperation between vampires and their supposed victims. "The creature has bewitched her," Aldric snarled. "Kill it, and the spell will be broken." Matthias felt the familiar weight of his ancient ring as power began to build around the standing stones. The choice was before them: fight against overwhelming odds or risk everything on a journey into the unknown. The Chronicle of Night lay open in the ancient library of Sanguine Keep, its pages filled with laws that had governed vampire society for over 3 millennia. Written in blood and bound in midnight black leather, the tome contained every precedent, every ruling, and every punishment that defined the relationship between vampires and the mortal world. Lady Seraphina ran her pale fingers across the relevant passage, her lips curving into a cold smile as she found what she sought. The law was clear. Any vampire who used their powers to interfere in purely mortal affairs would face immediate execution. No exceptions, no appeals. The ancient text left no room for interpretation, regardless of motive or circumstance. Seraphina had been Matthias's first progeny, turned during the early years of his reign as Alpha. She possessed the ethereal beauty common to their kind, platinum blonde hair that seemed to glow with its own light, porcelain skin unmarked by time, and violet eyes that held the wisdom of centuries. But beneath her angelic appearance lay a mind as sharp as any blade, and a loyalty to vampire law that bordered on fanaticism. She closed the chronicle with deliberate care, then gestured to the assembled vampires who awaited her command. 20 of the most elite enforcers in their society stood ready to travel to the mortal realm, each carrying weapons forged specifically to subdue rogue members of their own kind. "Prepare for immediate departure," she commanded. "Our former Alpha has chosen his fate. We shall ensure he receives it." Meanwhile, in the stone circle, the first exchange of violence erupted with supernatural swiftness. Sir Gareth had loosed a silver-tipped crossbow bolt aimed directly at Matthias's heart, but the vampire moved with inhuman speed, catching the projectile mere inches from his chest. The blessed silver burned his hand, sending wisps of smoke curling from his pale skin. "Impressive," Gareth acknowledged grimly. "But we came prepared for such tricks." The other hunters struck simultaneously, launching a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm even supernatural reflexes. Crossbow bolts filled the air like deadly rain, while mounted knights charged from multiple directions, their blessed weapons gleaming in the moonlight. Matthias became a blur of motion, dodging most attacks while deflecting others with strength that sent armed men flying from their saddles. But the sheer number of assailants and their professional coordination began to tell. A silver blade carved a burning line across his shoulder, another bolt grazed his thigh, and the blessed weapon's proximity weakened him more than he cared to admit. Elena watched the battle with growing alarm, feeling helpless as the man who had risked everything to save her was slowly being overwhelmed. When one of the hunters broke away from the main fight to grab her, she surprised him by fighting back with fierce determination. "I am not a helpless victim," she declared, using the heavy silver locket as an improvised weapon to strike her would-be captor. The man stumbled backward, more shocked by her resistance than actually injured. The distraction nearly proved fatal for Matthias. Sir Gareth's sword, blessed by 3 different archbishops, sliced deep into the vampire's side. The holy magic in the blade caused the wound to burn like molten metal, and Matthias staggered as his supernatural healing was unable to counter the blessed weapon's effects. "Now you see the futility of your rebellion," Gareth called out, advancing for a killing blow. "No creature of darkness can stand against the light of divine justice." Matthias straightened despite his injuries, his amber eyes blazing with renewed determination. "I have stood against darker things than you can imagine, knight, and I am far from finished." The vampire's hand found his ancient ring, and power began to flow through the standing stones around them. The carved symbols on the monoliths started to glow with eldritch light as forces older than human civilization responded to his call. Elena felt the change immediately, a sensation like static electricity that made her hair stand on end and her skin tingle. The very air seemed to thicken as supernatural energies gathered around the stone circle. "What are you doing?" she called out over the rising wind that seemed to come from nowhere. "Opening a door," Matthias replied through gritted teeth, maintaining his concentration despite the burning agony from his wounds. "Hold fast to me, no matter what you see." The space between the standing stones began to shimmer like heat waves rising from summer pavement. Reality itself seemed to bend and twist as the barrier between worlds grew thin. Through the distortion, Elena glimpsed something that made her breath catch, a realm of eternal twilight, where massive castles floated in violet skies and creatures of legend moved with casual grace. Sir Gareth recognized what was happening and spurred his horse forward desperately. "Stop him! He's opening a gateway to the Shadow Realm." But even as the hunters renewed their assault, another presence made itself known. Lady Seraphina materialized at the edge of the stone circle with the sudden silence that marked vampire travel through shadows. Her violet eyes took in the scene, the wounded Matthias, the mortal woman he protected, and the hunters who sought to destroy them both. "How far you have fallen, my creator," she said with genuine sadness. "Once you were the greatest among us. Now you break our most sacred laws for the sake of a mortal woman." Matthias turned to face his progeny, blood still seeping from his wounds. "Seraphina, I wondered when you would come. The chronicle of night is clear," she continued, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Interference in mortal affairs is forbidden. The penalty is death. Elena stepped closer to Matthias, despite the supernatural tension crackling through the air. He saved my life. How can that be wrong? Serafina's perfect features showed genuine confusion. You defend him? Do you not understand what he is? What we all are? I know exactly what he is, Elena replied with quiet dignity. He is someone who chose compassion over duty, love over law. If that makes him a monster, then perhaps your laws are what need to change. The statement sent ripples of shock through both the vampire enforcers and the human hunters. In all her centuries of existence, Serafina had never heard a mortal speak with such conviction about vampire nature. Interesting, the vampire lady mused. Perhaps there is more to this situation than the reports indicated. The gateway between worlds pulsed with increasing intensity, its pull growing stronger with each passing moment. Matthias knew they had only seconds before the portal either stabilized or collapsed entirely. Choose quickly, he told Elena. Come with me to a realm where we might find peace, or stay here and face whatever justice these hunters believe they serve. Elena looked around the stone circle at the wounded vampire who had sacrificed everything for her, at the enforcers who saw only law where she saw love, and at the hunters who would never understand that not all darkness was evil. Her choice would determine not only their fate, but the future relationship between their two worlds. The crown of shadows materialized in Serafina's pale hands, its dark metal seeming to absorb the moonlight around it. Forged from meteoric iron and inscribed with runes of dominion, the crown had been worn by every alpha vampire for over 2,000 years. It represented absolute authority over their kind, the right to command, to judge, and to execute those who violated sacred law. Matthias stared at the artifact he had once worn with pride, remembering the weight of responsibility it had carried. The crown pulsed with ancient power, its presence a stark reminder of everything he had abandoned when he chose exile over civil war. By the authority vested in me by the High Council, Serafina intoned formally, I declare you, Matthias Draven, in violation of the first law. You have used supernatural power to interfere in purely mortal affairs. The penalty is immediate execution. The vampire enforcers moved to surround the stone circle, their weapons drawn and ready. But before they could close the trap completely, Elena stepped forward with sudden determination. Wait, she commanded, her voice carrying an authority that surprised everyone present. Before you pass judgment, there are things you need to know about your precious laws. Serafina raised an elegant eyebrow. A mortal presumes to lecture vampires about our own traditions. Elena's hand moved to the silver locket at her throat, and for the first time she opened it in front of witnesses. Inside was not merely a portrait of her mother. The locket contained a hidden compartment that held a small scroll of parchment, yellowed with age and written in Latin. My family name is Ravencroft, Elena announced, her voice ringing clearly through the stone circle. But my mother's bloodline traces back much further to the de Montfort family, and before that, to those who first learned to hunt the creatures of darkness. Sir Gareth's eyes widened with sudden recognition. The bloodline of Street Erasmus, he breathed. It was thought extinct. Elena nodded grimly. My mother's family were vampire hunters for over 20 generations. They possessed a natural immunity to supernatural influence, a bloodline blessed by divine grace to resist the allure of the undead. The revelation sent shockwaves through both groups. Vampire hunters were not merely trained warriors, they were born to their calling, descended from humans who had been specially blessed to resist supernatural domination. Their blood itself was anathema to vampire magic, making them immune to mental compulsion, supernatural charm, and most forms of unholy influence. Matthias stared at Elena in amazement, understanding flooding through him. That's why I was drawn to you, he said softly. Not because of any supernatural compulsion, but because my attraction was genuine, perhaps the first real emotion I've felt in centuries. Impossible, Serafina protested, though uncertainty flickered in her violet eyes. If she carries hunter blood, you should not be able to bear her presence, much less touch her. Elena extended her hand toward Matthias, palm up. Touch me, she invited. Show them that love transcends the ancient hatreds between our peoples. Matthias reached out slowly, his pale fingers coming to rest against Elena's warm skin. There was no burning, no pain, no rejection, only the electric thrill of connection that had grown between them. How is this possible? One of the vampire enforcers demanded. Elena looked around the circle of supernatural beings and hardened hunters, her dark eyes blazing with conviction. Because the immunity my bloodline carries works both ways. I cannot be dominated by vampires, but neither can I hate them without cause. The blessing that protects me from supernatural evil also prevents me from seeing evil where none exists. She turned to face Serafina directly. Your laws were created to protect both vampires and humans from unnecessary conflict. But what happens when a vampire chooses to protect rather than prey upon mortals? What happens when love develops between natural enemies? Serafina's perfect composure began to crack. The laws exist for good reason. They prevent the chaos that would result from vampires becoming involved in mortal affairs. Do they? Elena challenged. Or do they simply enforce an artificial separation that benefits no one? Matthias used his power to save an innocent life, something your laws apparently consider worthy of death. The hunter-blessed mortal pulled the ancient scroll from her locket and held it up for all to see. This document was written by my ancestor, Sir Marcus de Montfort, after he encountered a vampire who saved his daughter from bandits rather than feeding upon her. He wrote of the possibility that not all creatures of darkness were truly evil, that some might be capable of choosing light over shadow. Sir Gareth's blessed cross burned against his chest as he struggled with concepts that challenged everything he had been taught. The legends speak of such things, he admitted reluctantly. Vampires who walked in service of good rather than evil. But they were dismissed as myths. Perhaps, Elena said carefully, it's time to reconsider what we think we know about the nature of good and evil. The gateway between worlds pulsed more urgently as the magical energies reached critical instability. Matthias could feel the portal beginning to collapse. They had mere minutes before the opportunity to escape was lost forever. But more importantly, he sensed a shift in the supernatural tensions surrounding them. Elena's revelation had created doubt where there had been certainty, questions where there had been absolute answers. She speaks truth, said a voice from among the vampire enforcers. An older vampire named Cornelius stepped forward, his ancient eyes thoughtful. I remember stories from the early days, tales of vampires who chose to protect rather than prey upon mortals. Such individuals were rare, but they existed. Serafina's grip on the crown of shadows tightened. Even if such things were possible, the law is clear, interference is forbidden. Then perhaps the law is wrong, Elena said simply. The statement hung in the air like a challenge thrown down before gods. Never in vampire history had their fundamental laws been questioned so directly, and never by a mortal whose bloodline gave her words such weight. Matthias felt something fundamental shift within himself as he watched Elena face down creatures that could destroy her with a thought. Her courage, her willingness to challenge ancient prejudices for the sake of justice and love, reminded him why he had first sought to protect mortals rather than dominate them. Elena is right, he said, his voice carrying the authority of his former position. The laws we created to prevent chaos have instead created stagnation. They force vampires to live in isolation from the very world they inhabit, denying the possibility of growth or redemption. He looked directly at Serafina, his amber eyes blazing with renewed purpose. I was Alpha once. I led our people with wisdom and restraint. If that gives my words any weight, I ask you to consider this. What if the greatest strength of our kind is not our separation from mortals, but our potential to live alongside them? Seraphina's violet eyes flickered between the crown of shadows in her hands and the wounded vampire who had once been her creator and leader. The artifact pulsed with ancient power, demanding adherence to laws that had guided their kind for millennia. But Elena's revelation had shattered the fundamental assumptions those laws were based upon. If vampires and humans could coexist, if love could bridge the gap between natural enemies, then everything they thought they knew about their nature was wrong. "The High Council will need to hear of this," Seraphina said finally. "These revelations require judgment from wiser minds than mine." "And until then?" Matthias asked. Seraphina looked at the unstable gateway, then back at the unlikely pair who had challenged everything she believed. "Until then, you remain under my protection. But understand this reprieve is temporary. The Council's judgment will be final." Elena felt a mixture of relief and apprehension flood through her. They had won a temporary victory, but the greater battle for acceptance between their peoples had only just begun. The gateway collapsed with a sound like breaking glass, sealing off the escape route to the Shadow Realm. Whatever happened next, they would face it in the mortal world, surrounded by allies and enemies whose ancient hatreds might prove stronger than love. The Phoenix Blade lay hidden beneath the floorboards of a ruined chapel on the outskirts of Ravenshire, wrapped in blessed silk and surrounded by protective wards that had kept it safe for 3 centuries. Elena knelt in the dusty darkness, her fingers tracing the outline of her family's ancestral weapon through its ancient wrappings. The sword had been forged specifically to kill vampires, its steel blessed by 7 different saints, its edge honed with powdered silver, and its pommel set with a ruby that glowed with inner fire when the undead drew near. "Are you certain about this?" Matthias asked quietly as he watched her unwrap the legendary blade. His supernatural senses could feel the weapon's power even through its protective bindings, a force that made his skin prickle and his ancient instincts scream warnings of danger. Elena's hands paused for a moment as she considered his question. 3 days had passed since the confrontation at the Stone Circle, and they had spent that time in careful preparation for what was to come. Seraphina had granted them temporary sanctuary while the High Council of Vampires deliberated, but that protection came with a price. They were essentially prisoners, confined to the abandoned chapel while both sides marshaled their forces. "I'm certain that we need every advantage we can get," Elena replied, finally pulling away the silk wrapping to reveal the Phoenix Blade in all its terrible glory. The sword was beautiful in the way that perfect weapons often were, its blade gleaming like liquid starlight, its crossguard shaped like phoenix wings, and its grip wrapped in leather that had been blessed by martyred saints. Most striking was the ruby in its pommel, which pulsed with a warm red light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with Elena's heartbeat. Matthias took an involuntary step backward as the weapon's presence filled the small chapel. He said with wonder and concern, "The blade knows you carry the blood of its creators." Elena stood slowly, testing the sword's weight and balance. Despite her lack of formal training, the weapon felt natural in her hands, as if it had been made specifically for her grip. The ruby's glow intensified as she moved, bathing the chapel's interior in crimson light. "My great-grandmother's journal mentioned this sword," Elena said, practicing a few careful cuts through the air. "She wrote that it would only respond to a true descendant of the Hunter bloodline, and only when wielded in defense of the innocent." "And what happens when you point it at someone who isn't truly evil?" Matthias asked, with genuine curiosity. Elena turned to face him, the blade held between them. The ruby's glow dimmed noticeably, and the sword felt heavier in her hands, as if the weapon itself was questioning her intent. "It knows," she said with wonder. "The blade can sense the difference between protective action and murder." Their moment of discovery was interrupted by the arrival of Sir Gareth, who entered the chapel with his usual military bearing despite the unofficial truce that had been declared. The knight's blessed cross still burned against his chest, but its light seemed muted in the presence of the Phoenix Blade. "Lady Elena," he said formally, offering a respectful bow, "I bring word from the High Council. They have reached a decision regarding your unusual circumstances. Matthias tensed, ready to defend Elena if the council's judgment proved hostile. But Gareth's expression suggested something more complex than simple condemnation. The council has agreed to hear testimony from both sides, the knight continued. They will convene tomorrow at sunset in the great hall of Sanguine Keep. You are both commanded to appear before them to present your case. And if we refuse, Elena asked, though she already knew the answer, then the original sentence of death will be carried out immediately, Gareth replied grimly. The council's patience has limits, even for situations as unprecedented as yours. As the knight departed to carry word of their decision back to his superiors, Elena and Matthias found themselves alone with the weight of their impossible situation. Tomorrow they would stand trial before the most powerful vampires in existence, arguing for the right to love across the ancient divide between their peoples. "Tell me about the council," Elena said, as she carefully rewrapped the phoenix blade and secured it at her side beneath her cloak. "What kind of beings will we be facing?" Matthias settled onto one of the chapel's broken pews, his expression troubled. "The High Council consists of 5 elder vampires, each over 1,000 years old. They were ancient when I was first turned, and their power is considerable." He described each council member in detail, Lord Valentius, whose mastery of mental compulsion could break the strongest wills. Lady Morgaine, who commanded the shadows themselves as living weapons. Master Chen, whose speed made him appear to teleport rather than simply move quickly. Duchess Elisaveta, who could drain the life force from mortals with a touch. And finally, Elder Thaddeus, the oldest among them, whose very presence could inspire paralyzing fear in both vampires and humans. "They are not evil," Matthias explained carefully, "but they are ancient, set in their ways, and deeply suspicious of change. The laws they enforce have kept our kind safe for millennia, and now we're asking them to abandon those laws based on the love between a rogue vampire and a mortal woman," Elena said with a rueful smile. "I can see why they might be skeptical." Matthias moved closer to her, taking her hands in his, despite the burning presence of the phoenix blade so near her body. "Elena, I need you to understand something. What we're attempting tomorrow is more than just defending our right to be together. We're challenging the fundamental assumptions that have governed supernatural society since before Christ walked the earth." "I know," she replied quietly, "but sometimes the old ways need to be challenged. Sometimes love really is stronger than fear." As night fell over the ruined chapel, they prepared for what might be their final evening together. Elena practiced with the phoenix blade under Matthias's watchful eye, learning to channel her hunter heritage into something more than mere violence. The sword responded to her emotions, growing brighter when she thought of protecting innocence and dimming when anger or hatred crept into her heart. Matthias, meanwhile, spent the hours in meditation, reconnecting with powers he had abandoned during his long exile. The ancient ring on his finger pulsed with renewed energy as he prepared to face beings who had once been his equals. He would need every advantage he could muster if they were to survive the council's judgment. "There's something else you should know," Elena said, as they shared a simple meal of bread and water blessed by the chapel's long-dead priest. "The phoenix blade isn't just a weapon, it's also a symbol. According to my family's records, it was created as proof that vampires and humans could work together for a common good." Matthias looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "The sword was forged through cooperation between my ancestor and a vampire smith named Aurelius. He provided the supernatural techniques needed to bind the blessings into the metal, while the Hunter family provided the sacred materials and holy rituals. Together, they created something neither could have made alone. The revelation hung between them like a bridge across centuries of hatred and mistrust. If Elena's ancestors had once worked with vampires to create weapons for protecting the innocent, then perhaps the ancient divide between their peoples was not as absolute as everyone believed. "Do you think the council will see it that way?" Elena asked. "I hope so," Matthias replied, "but we must be prepared for the possibility that they won't. The Phoenix Blade may protect you from vampire magic, but it won't shield you from political judgment." As dawn approached, they held each other close in the ruins of the chapel, finding comfort in simple human contact despite the supernatural powers that surrounded them. Elena's mortal warmth provided an anchor for Matthias's immortal existence, while his steadfast protection gave her the courage to face whatever tomorrow might bring. "Whatever happens at the trial," Elena whispered against his chest, "I want you to know that these past few days have been the happiest of my life." Matthias pressed his lips to her dark hair, breathing in the scent that had become more precious to him than anything in his 8 centuries of existence. "And you have shown me that redemption is possible, even for creatures like me." The Phoenix Blade pulsed gently at Elena's side, its ruby heart glowing with warm approval of the love that had grown between natural enemies. Tomorrow they would stand trial before powers that could reshape the supernatural world, but tonight they were simply 2 souls who had found each other across an impossible divide. The storm was coming, but they would face it together. The bell of Street Erasmus tolled its ancient bronze voice across the valley as the sun painted the eastern horizon in shades of gold and crimson. Each resonant note seemed to carry the weight of prophecy, either marking Elena's liberation or announcing her final dawn. The massive bell had hung in the village church for over 4 centuries, cast from metal blessed by the patron saint of vampire hunters and inscribed with prayers in a dozen languages. Elena stood at the entrance to Sanguine Keep, the Phoenix Blade concealed beneath her travelling cloak, as she gazed up at the fortress that housed the High Council of Vampires. The structure defied mortal architecture, its black stone towers twisted impossibly skyward, their surfaces carved with symbols that seemed to shift in the changing light. Bridges of crystallized shadow connected the towers, spanning distances that should have made them structurally impossible. "The keep exists partially in our realm and partially in the shadow world," Matthias explained as they approached the main gates. "Reality bends here to accommodate powers that mortal minds cannot fully comprehend." The gates themselves were massive works of art, and intimidation-wrought iron twisted into the shapes of ravens and bats, their eyes set with rubies that tracked movement like living things. As Elena and Matthias drew near, the gates swung open with silent, supernatural grace. The great hall of Sanguine Keep stretched before them like a cathedral dedicated to darkness and majesty. Vaulted ceilings disappeared into shadow far above, while columns of black marble supported galleries where lesser vampires had gathered to witness these unprecedented proceedings. The air thrummed with supernatural energy as over 100 immortal beings focused their attention on the mortal woman who dared to challenge their fundamental laws. At the far end of the hall, 5 ornate thrones rose from a dais of polished obsidian. Each throne was carved from a different material: bone, black glass, meteoric iron, crystallized blood, and what appeared to be solidified moonlight. Upon these seats of power sat the High Council, their ancient eyes fixed upon the approaching pair with expressions that revealed nothing of their intentions. Lord Valentius spoke first, his voice carrying the hypnotic cadence that had swayed minds for over 15 centuries. "Matthias Draven, former Alpha of the Northern Covens, you stand accused of violating the first law by interfering in purely mortal affairs. How do you answer this charge?" Matthias stepped forward, his bearing still carrying the authority of his former position despite his exile. "I acknowledge my actions, Lord Valentius, but I challenge the fundamental assumptions upon which the law is based." A ripple of shocked whispers ran through the assembled vampires. Never in their history had anyone directly challenged the wisdom of the first law during formal proceedings. Lady Morgaine leaned forward on her throne of black glass, shadows writhing around her like living things. "You dare question laws that have protected our kind since before Rome fell. Explain yourself." "Exile." Elena felt the Phoenix Blade pulse against her side as she stepped up beside Matthias. The weapon's ruby heart began to glow, its light visible even through the heavy fabric of her cloak. "If I may address the council," Elena said, her voice clear and strong despite the supernatural pressure bearing down upon her. Elder Thaddeus, oldest among the five, fixed his ancient gaze upon her. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of millennia. "A mortal seeks to speak before this council? Unprecedented. Yet your bloodline grants you certain privileges. Speak, daughter of hunters." Elena drew back her cloak, revealing the phoenix blade in all its terrible glory. The sword's presence sent waves of unease through the assembled vampires, its blessed steel and sacred ruby representing everything they had been taught to fear. "This blade was forged through cooperation between my ancestor and a vampire named Aurelius," Elena announced, her words echoing through the vast hall. "Together, they created a weapon not for genocide, but for protecting the innocent, both mortal and immortal." Master Chen moved with his characteristic speed, appearing beside Elena faster than mortal eyes could follow. "Impossible. No vampire would aid in creating weapons meant to destroy our kind." "Not to destroy," Elena corrected firmly. "To distinguish between those who deserve destruction and those who deserve protection. The phoenix blade can only harm those with truly evil intent. Against those who act with pure hearts, it is powerless." To demonstrate, Elena drew the sword and turned its point toward Matthias. The ruby in the pommel dimmed to barely a spark, and the blade trembled in her hands as if fighting against her grip. "The weapon knows," she continued, turning to face the council while keeping the sword raised. "It recognizes that love and sacrifice can exist even in creatures you consider inherently evil." Duchess Elisaveta spoke for the first time, her voice like silk over steel. "And what of the threat to our secrecy? If vampires begin forming attachments to mortals, how long before our existence becomes common knowledge?" Matthias answered before Elena could respond. "Perhaps secrecy built on fear and isolation is not our greatest strength. Perhaps our true power lies in proving that we can coexist with mortals rather than simply hiding from them." The bell of Street Erasmus tolled again, its bronze voice carrying across the supernatural realm. Each note seemed to count down to a moment of decision that would reshape the relationship between vampires and humanity forever. Matthias's heartstone pulsed with ethereal light as he removed it from the chain around his neck, the mystical gem containing the very essence of his immortal existence. Forged during his transformation 8 centuries ago, the stone held not just his supernatural power, but the accumulated wisdom and memories of his long life. To offer it freely was to risk everything: his immortality, his strength, perhaps even his continued existence. The assembled vampires in the great hall fell silent as Matthias held the heartstone aloft, its crystalline facets catching and reflecting the chamber's otherworldly illumination. The gem was roughly the size of a robin's egg, its surface seeming to contain swirling galaxies of midnight blue and silver light. "I offer my immortal essence as proof of my commitment," Matthias declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast hall. "If Elena's words are false, if our love is nothing more than supernatural manipulation, then let the heartstone judge us both." Lord Valentius leaned forward with sudden interest. "You would submit to the trial of truth? Do you understand the consequences of failure?" "I understand that some things are worth risking everything for," Matthias replied, his amber eyes never leaving Elena's face. The trial of truth was among the most ancient of vampire rituals, a test that used the heartstone's connection to its owner's essence to verify absolute honesty. But the magic came with a terrible price. If the truth being tested proved false, the stone would shatter, taking the vampire's immortal life with it. Elena felt the phoenix blade grow warm against her side as she watched Matthias prepare to stake his existence on their love. "What must I do?" she asked quietly. Elder Thaddeus spoke the ritual words in a language that predated written history. "Place your hand upon the heartstone. Child of hunters, speak your truth, and let the ancient magic judge its worth. Elena stepped forward without hesitation, her mortal fingers closing around the mystical gem. The moment her skin touched its surface, visions flooded through her mind, fragments of Matthias's long existence, memories of loneliness and nobility, centuries of careful restraint and growing isolation. "I see his true nature," Elena said, her voice filled with wonder. 800 years of choosing protection over predation, mercy over violence. He saved my life not because of supernatural compulsion, but because he recognized something in me that mirrored his own desire to choose light over darkness. The heartstone blazed brighter, responding to the truth in her words. Around the hall, vampires watched in amazement as the ancient artifact confirmed what many had thought impossible. "And what of your own feelings?" Lady Morgaine demanded. "How can mortal emotion compare to immortal devotion?" Elena's grip on the heartstone tightened, and new visions flowed through her consciousness, images of possible futures, lives they might build together if given the chance. "My love for him is not diminished by my mortality," she replied firmly. "If anything, knowing our time is precious makes it more valuable, not less." Master Chen appeared beside the dais with his supernatural speed. The stone accepts her truth, but what of the practical concerns? How can vampire law adapt to accommodate such unions? It was Duchess Elisaveta who provided the answer, her ancient wisdom cutting through centuries of tradition. "Perhaps the law need not change, perhaps it simply needs to recognize exceptions. Love that transcends natural boundaries. Unions that strengthen rather than weaken our kind." The heartstone pulsed in Elena's hands, its light now steady and warm. The artifact had judged their bond and found it genuine, but the final decision still rested with the council. Elder Thaddeus rose from his throne of solidified moonlight, his ancient frame moving with surprising grace. "The trial of truth has rendered its verdict. The love between vampire and mortal, between natural enemies, has been proven genuine. The question now becomes, what precedent do we set for others?" Elena felt inspiration strike like lightning. "Not precedent," she said, "but possibility. Let our union be proof that cooperation between our peoples is achievable, not a guarantee that all such relationships will succeed." She looked around the assembled vampires, many of whom were watching with expressions of growing hope rather than fear. "Create new laws that judge each case on its merits. Require proof of genuine feeling, demonstration of mutual benefit, evidence that both parties choose the relationship freely." Matthias took her free hand in his, their joined fingers encompassing the heartstone. "We ask not for the dissolution of all barriers," he added, "but for the recognition that some barriers can be bridged by those willing to prove themselves worthy." The silence in the great hall stretched taut as the 5 council members exchanged glances laden with unspoken communication. Centuries of precedent warred with the evidence of their own eyes, the heartstone's unambiguous verification of true love between species that should have been incapable of such connection. Finally, Lord Valentius spoke the words that would reshape supernatural society forever. "The Council recognizes the validity of this union and hereby establishes new protocols for evaluating similar cases. Love that proves itself through trial and sacrifice shall be honored, regardless of the nature of those who share it." The heartstone blazed with triumphant light, sealing their victory in its crystalline depths. The new dawn covenant lay spread across the ancient oak table in Elena and Matthias's cottage, its parchment glowing with magical seals that bound 2 worlds in unprecedented harmony. Written in both vampire script and mortal languages, the treaty established formal diplomatic relations between supernatural society and a select group of human leaders who had proven themselves worthy of trust. 5 years had passed since the trial that changed everything. The cottage where Elena and Matthias now lived sat on a hill overlooking the village of Ravenshire, its stone walls warmed by afternoon sunlight that no longer caused the former vampire any discomfort. The transformation had been Matthias's choice, trading immortality for the chance to age alongside the woman he loved, to experience the precious brevity that gave mortal life its meaning. Elena worked in their garden, her hands dark with rich soil as she tended herbs that served both culinary and medicinal purposes. The phoenix blade hung in a place of honor above their mantelpiece, its ruby heart glowing softly whenever supernatural visitors came to call. The weapon had become a symbol of their union, proof that ancient enemies could not only coexist, but flourish together. "The delegation from the northern covens will arrive tomorrow," Matthias said as he joined Elena among the growing plants. His appearance had changed subtly over the years, fine lines around his eyes, silver threading through his dark hair, the accumulated marks of a life lived fully rather than merely endured. Elena smiled as she brushed dirt from her hands. "Lady Seraphina still has difficulty believing you chose mortality. She's learning to accept it," Matthias replied with gentle humor. "Though she insists on bringing me gifts that might restore my immortality, just in case I change my mind." Their relationship with Seraphina had evolved from antagonism to grudging respect to genuine affection. The vampire lady now served as liaison between the High Council and the growing number of mixed couples who had emerged following Elena and Matthias's precedent. The cottage door opened to admit their most frequent visitor, Sir Gareth, whose blessed cross no longer burned in Matthias's presence since the transformation. The former vampire hunter had become an unlikely friend, his rigid worldview gradually expanding to accommodate the reality that good and evil existed on both sides of the supernatural divide. "The latest reports from the council," Gareth said, placing a leather satchel on the table beside the covenant. 17 more applications for recognition of mixed unions, including one between a vampire and a witch, which should prove interesting. Elena laughed, the sound bright and warm in the afternoon light. "The witch probably has more supernatural power than her vampire partner now." "Indeed," Gareth agreed with a rare smile. "The world grows stranger and more wonderful each year." The New Dawn Covenant had accomplished more than merely legitimizing supernatural human relationships. It had opened channels of communication that were slowly healing centuries of mistrust and fear. Vampire scholars worked alongside human researchers to advance medical knowledge. Supernatural creatures assisted in solving crimes that had baffled mortal investigators. Most importantly, the ancient cycle of predation and retaliation was finally beginning to break. Not all vampires accepted the new ways. Some retreated deeper into isolation rather than adapt to changing times. Similarly, some humans viewed any cooperation with supernatural beings as tantamount to trafficking with devils. But for every voice raised in protest, 2 more spoke in favor of the growing harmony between worlds. Elena and Matthias had played crucial roles in establishing the new order, but they had gradually stepped back from public life to focus on their personal happiness. Their cottage had become an unofficial embassy, where supernatural beings and mortals could meet on neutral ground, sharing knowledge and building friendships that would have been impossible just years before. "There's something else," Gareth said, his expression turning more serious. "Lord Aldric has been sighted in the Eastern Territories. It seems he's gathering followers among those who oppose the Covenant." Elena's hand moved unconsciously to her silver locket, which now contained not just her mother's portrait, but a small painting of her and Matthias on their wedding day. "I wondered when he might resurface. Hatred like his doesn't simply disappear." Matthias moved closer to his wife, his protective instincts still strong despite his mortality. "We knew this day would come. Some people cannot accept change, even when that change makes the world better." The 3 friends sat in comfortable silence as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The cottage garden was alive, with the sounds of evening insects humming, birds settling into their roosts, and the distant laughter of village children playing in the streets below. "Do you ever regret it?" Elena asked quietly, taking Matthias's weathered hand in hers. "Giving up immortality for a mortal lifetime?" Matthias raised their joined hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her fingers. Never. 8 centuries of existence taught me many things, but it was only in learning to be mortal that I truly learned to live. Elena smiled, her dark eyes reflecting the same contentment that had sustained them through 5 years of marriage. Then, we've chosen well. As night fell over Ravenshire, lights began to twinkle in windows throughout the village. Some belonged to purely mortal families, others to supernatural beings who had chosen to make their homes among humans, and still others to mixed couples who represented the future that Elena and Matthias had helped create. The new dawn covenant glowed softly on their table, its magical seals ensuring that the peace they had fought for would endure long after they were gone. But for now, it was enough to sit together in their garden, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky while planning for tomorrow's simple pleasures. They had chosen love over tradition, hope over fear, and the uncertain promise of the future over the rigid certainties of the past. In doing so, they had not only found happiness together, but had shown 2 worlds that ancient hatreds need not be eternal. The vampire who had walked alone for centuries, and the woman who had thought herself powerless, had discovered that love, when it proves itself through trial and sacrifice, truly can change everything.